Okay, let's dive in. When we talk about grief now, especially with things like prolonged grief disorder in the DSM,
Hmm.
it feels very, well, medical, doesn't it?
It really does. That's the common narrative, focusing on those recent diagnostic labels.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
it's something a doctor has to step in for.
Exactly. But the sources we're looking at today, particularly this really interesting paper by D. Grace Smith, suggests something else. A different history,
A
actually.
different history. You mean this whole medical view of grief didn't just pop up recently?
That's the core argument. Smith's analysis suggests this medicalization, it wasn't sudden, it was gradual, starting way earlier than we might think.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So our mission today is to explore that. Smith argues the groundwork was laid much earlier, specifically looking at changes within psychology, psychiatry, the psych disciplines between roughly 1975 and 1995, well before those big diagnostic changes hit the headlines.
Right, so if formal diagnoses weren't the main driver back then, how do
Yeah.
they start framing grief in this more medical way during that period?
Well, Smith uses critical discourse analysis, basically, looking really closely at the language used in professional texts back
To
then.
see how ideas were being shaped.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And she points to three key shifts. First, these side disciplines started claiming essentially exclusive expertise over grief.
Ah, so positioning themselves as the only real experts, the go-to authorities.
Pretty much. The language in academic papers started changing. You see the subtle, sometimes not so subtle, dismissal of older, maybe more cultural or community-based ways of grieving.
Like saying traditional ways weren't good enough.
Sort of, or even pathologizing them. Smith points out how papers started claiming that, American culture, for example, lacked proper mourning customs, implying a vacuum that only professionals could really fill.
Wow.
Yeah, and you see fewer mentions over time of support from, say, clergy or funeral directors who were mentioned more in earlier stuff. Instead, after about 1987, it's almost all therapists or mental health professionals.
So actively pushing aside those other supports.
The discourse certainly shifted that way. One paper even suggested people needed psychological help because society wasn't providing those older ritual channels anymore. It frames the profession as the necessary solution.
Okay, that's a big shift in who gets to be the expert. What else?
The second thing was how grief was studied. The methods became much more, let's say, medicalized and scientific in appearance.
I mean, more numbers.
Exactly, a big push towards quantitative methods. The first standardized grief scale, the Texas Inventory, came out in '77, and that was kind of a turning point.
Right.
Suddenly, older studies, the ones maybe based on narratives or more holistic views, started being labeled unsystematic or methodologically questionable.
Ah, the drive for data.
Yeah, prioritizing scales, stats, measurable things. Grief also started being talked about as multidimensional, broken down into separate bits you could measure and correlate, moving away from maybe deeper, more integrated understandings.
Trying to pin it down with numbers.
Got it.
And the third shift Smith talks about.
This one's about how grief itself was defined, particularly what counted as normal versus pathological.
Okay, how did that change?
Things that were often listed as part of typical healthy grief before, like maybe briefly feeling the presence of the person who died or transient hallucinations, those started disappearing from the definitions of normal grief in later papers.
So they became signs of a problem instead.
They started showing up more in discussions of pathology, yes. And interestingly, something like guilt, which older psychoanalytic thinking often linked to more complicated grief, not simple mourning, started being included more often within the definition of normal grief.
Huh. That's quite a shuffle in definitions.
It is. And tied to that, the idea of recovery or health after grief also shifted.
How so?
Earlier ideas might focus on, reorganizing your life, integrating the loss somehow. But by the '90s, Smith finds recovery was increasingly defined as getting back to pre-bereavement levels of functioning.
Functioning, like productivity.
Often, yeah. Sometimes explicitly specified as being able to return to work.
Wow, okay. That really does sound like it echoes those rising neoliberal values around efficiency and economic output during that time.
It seems to align, doesn't it? And that's what's so compelling about Smith's analysis. It wasn't one big thing. It was these connected shifts in language and methods and definitions, all building up the authority of the psi disciplines and influenced by broader cultural trends. This all laid the groundwork for seeing grief as inherently medical, needing experts, decades before the formal diagnoses we talk about today.
So recapping this deep dive,
Mm.
the idea that grief is primarily a medical issue needing professional treatment isn't just a recent thing tied to the DSM.
Not according to this analysis, no. It was a much longer, more gradual process starting back in the late 20th century, driven by changes in who counted as an expert, how grief was studied, and even how health and recovery were defined, often reflecting the broader societal values of the time.
It really reframes the conversation.
It does, and it leaves us with a really important question to think about. For you, the listener, considering this history that Smith uncovers, how does our current understanding of grief stack up against how it might have been seen before these shifts really took hold in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s? And maybe more importantly, what does that difference mean for how we approach grief today, personally, and maybe in our communities too?